Before we begin, if you enjoyed tales of knights, banquets, and unfortunate mishaps involving misplaced trousers, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more delightfully dull bedtime stories. Now, let us settle into the first chapter of our saga, where honor is fragile and pants are even more so. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Sir Reginald of the Muddy Boots was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a man accustomed to luxury. His armor was perpetually smudged with the grime of forgotten battlefields, his tabard bore the stains of questionable tavern stews, and his helmet had a dent from an incident involving a particularly aggressive goose. Still, he was a knight, and knights, no matter how disheveled, were occasionally summoned to places where the floors were polished and the cutlery outnumbered the guests. It was on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday when the invitation arrived. The parchment was so thick it could have doubled as a shield, and the wax seal bore the crest of Duke Florian, the fastidious, a man known for his impeccable table manners and his deep, abiding hatred of crumbs. The letter itself was written in a looping script that suggested the scribe had been paid by the curlicue, and it extended to Sir Reginald the honor of attending the Duke's annual midwinter banquet. Reginald read the words twice, then a third time, just to be certain his name hadn't been confused with someone else. But no, there it was, Sir Reginald of the Muddy Boots, Knight of the Realm, such as it is, cordially invited. The phrasing was peculiar, but then again, so was the Duke. The invitation came with instructions: arrive promptly at sundown, wear one's finest attire, and under no circumstances bring one's own trencher. This last stipulation puzzled Reginald, as he had never considered bringing his own dining slab to a banquet, but he supposed the Duke had his reasons. Perhaps there had been an incident. Preparations began in earnest. Reginald's squire, a perpetually exhausted youth named Hubert, was tasked with polishing the knight's armor until it shone like a nobleman's conscience, which is to say, not very much, but it was the effort that counted. The tabard was beaten free of dried gravy, the boots were scraped of their namesake mud, and the helmet was hammered back into something resembling headwear, though the goose dent remained as a sort of battle scar. Reginald himself spent an entire afternoon practicing his courtly bow, only to realize halfway through that he had been doing it backward. Hubert, too polite to correct him, simply nodded along and made a mental note to stand far away during introductions. The day of the banquet arrived with the kind of ominous stillness that usually precedes a storm or a tax audit. Reginald, clad in his newly polished, if slightly lopsided, armor, mounted his horse, a beleaguered mare named Buttercup, who had long since given up on dignity, and set off toward the Duke's estate. The road was winding, the weather was brisk, and the local wildlife seemed unusually interested in his progress. A squirrel chittered at him from a tree branch, as if warning him of impending folly. Reginald ignored it. He had faced worse omens. The Duke's castle loomed on the horizon, its towers piercing the sky like the teeth of a comb designed for giants. The drawbridge was down, the portcullis was up, and the courtyard bustled with servants carrying trays, tuning lutes, and herding peacocks. The peacocks, Reginald noted, looked profoundly unhappy about their role in the evening's entertainment. At the gates, a herald with a voice like a rusty hinge announced his arrival. Sir Reginald of the Muddy Boots, he boomed, and the assembled nobility turned as one, their expressions hovering between curiosity and concern. Reginald straightened his tabard, took a deep breath, and stepped forward into the warmth of the hall, unaware that by night's end he would lose not only his honor but also, quite literally, his pants. But that, dear listener, is a misfortune best saved for another chapter. Chapter 2. The Gleaming Armor. Sir Reginald had always believed that armor, much like honor, was best maintained through frequent use and the occasional beating with a blunt object. Polishing was, in his view, a frivolous activity reserved for knights who had more time than enemies. But the Duke's banquet was no ordinary occasion. And so with great reluctance he had surrendered himself to the torturous ritual of shining metal until it reflected more than just his own existential dread. Hubert the squire had taken to the task with the grim determination of a man who knew his future employment depended on it. He scrubbed, he buffed, he muttered under his breath about the injustices of feudal labor. The armor, which had spent the better part of a decade accumulating layers of grime, blood, and what might have been a regrettable encounter with a poorly sealed jar of honey, resisted at first. But after several hours, a small mountain of soiled rags, and one near-fatal slip with a pumice stone, it began to gleam. Reginald, watching from a safe distance, lest he be roped into manual labor, offered occasional words of encouragement. "You're doing fine work, Hubert," he said, as the squire wrestled with a stubborn patch of rust near the left pauldron. "I haven't seen that bit of metal since the siege of Brackenford." Hubert paused, panting. "My lord, I think this isn't rust. I think it's lichen." Reginald squinted. "Ah, well, that explains the itching." By the time the armor was deemed presentable, or at least no longer a biohazard, it was nearly dusk. Reginald, now clad in his refurbished shell, clanked experimentally. The sound was less like the noble ringing of a warrior and more like a sack of cookware tumbling down a staircase. Still, it was an improvement. Next came the matter of his tabard. The once proud heraldry of his house had faded into something resembling a Rorschach test, with the added charm of smelling vaguely of onions. Hubert, ever resourceful, had attempted to wash it, only to discover that the fabric had reached a state of permanent discoloration. A discreet application of berry juice and a hasty restitching of the emblem had sufficed in a pinch. From a distance, and in dim lighting, it almost looked intentional. With his attire in order, Reginald turned his attention to the most daunting task of all, conversation. The Duke's banquets were notorious for their rigid etiquette and the expectation that guests would regale one another with tales of valor. Reginald had never been much of a storyteller, mostly because his actual exploits tended to involve more stumbling than swordplay. But he had learned long ago that the key to a successful knightly anecdote was to omit the parts where things went wrong. He cleared his throat and practiced on Hubert. "There I was," he began, striking what he hoped was a heroic pose, surrounded by a dozen mercenaries, their blades glinting in the moonlight like the teeth of a very sharp wolf. Hubert, who had heard the story before, nodded dutifully. "And did I falter?" Reginald continued. "Did I retreat? No. I stood my ground, my sword held high, my heart as unyielding as a particularly stubborn turnip." He paused. "That last bit needed work." Hubert coughed. "Perhaps unyielding as the mountains, my lord." Yes, that's better. Unyielding as the mountains. And then, with a single stroke, I tripped over your own scabbard and knocked yourself unconscious on a rock," Hubert supplied helpfully. Reginald frowned. "We are omitting that part." By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Reginald had rehearsed 3 acceptable tales of valor, each more embellished than the last. He had also practiced his bow 7 times, though Hubert had quietly suggested that stopping at 5 might spare him a strained back. At last the moment arrived. Buttercup, his long-suffering mare, was saddled, though she gave him a look that suggested she would much prefer to spend the evening in a nice, quiet stable. Reginald, now gleaming in the flickering torchlight, mounted with as much dignity as a man encased in metal could muster. "Remember, Hubert," he said, adjusting his helmet, "if anyone asks, the incident with the goat was a tactical diversion." Hubert sighed. "Of course, my lord." And with that, Sir Reginald of the Muddy Boots set off toward the Duke's estate, his armor shining, his tabard questionably stained, and his confidence hanging by a thread. Little did he know that the banquet would test not just his storytelling skills, but his very ability to keep his trousers intact. But that, of course, is a calamity for another time. Chapter 3. The Duke's Grand Hall. The Duke's banquet hall was a masterpiece of excess, a cavernous space where every surface gleamed with the kind of opulence that made peasants faint just thinking about the tax burden required to fund it. The walls were hung with tapestries so intricate they probably contained hidden messages, or at the very least, the desperate pleas of the weavers who had gone blind stitching them. The floor was a mosaic of imported marble, polished to such a shine that more than one guest had already slipped and been quietly dragged away by discreet servants before they could disrupt the evening's carefully curated atmosphere of superiority. At the center of it all stood the Duke himself, Florian the fastidious, perched upon a raised dais like a particularly smug owl. His doublet was embroidered with enough gold thread to ransom a small kingdom, and his beard was so meticulously groomed it likely had its own attendant. He surveyed the hall with the serene confidence of a man who had never once in his life wondered where his next meal was coming from, or whether his boots would ever dry out properly after a long march. Reginald, still adjusting to the fact that his armor no longer creaked like a haunted ship, took in the spectacle with a mixture of awe and quiet horror. The tables groaned under the weight of dishes that defied both logic and good taste. There was a pie so large it could have housed a family of 4, its crust artfully shaped into the Duke's own likeness, if the Duke had been a slightly squashed and overcooked version of himself. The centerpiece, however, was the infamous peacock pie, an architectural marvel where the bird's roasted flesh had been stuffed back into its own skin, feathers reattached and its head propped up with a small wooden stake so that it appeared to be gazing judgmentally at anyone who dared carve into it. The guests were no less extraordinary. Lords and ladies bedecked in silks so fine they whispered when they moved, their faces powdered to the point of resembling startled ghosts. Jewelry sparkled with the cold indifference of wealth, and the air was thick with the competing scents of rosewater, sweat, and the faint but undeniable musk of meat that had been left out slightly too long before serving. Then there were the entertainers. A troop of jesters on stilts lurched through the crowd like drunk herons, their bells jingling with every precarious step. One of them, a particularly reckless individual, was juggling live chickens while balancing on a wooden ball. The chickens, it must be said, did not seem to be enjoying the experience. A minstrel in the corner plucked at a lute and sang a ballad about the Duke's legendary patience, a subject so thin in material that the song lasted approximately 45 seconds before looping back on itself in desperation. Reginald, who had been to war, survived dysentery, and once fought off a badger with nothing but a spoon, felt his courage waver. He had rehearsed his stories. He had polished his armor. But nothing could have prepared him for the sheer, overwhelming absurdity of the Duke's grand hall. It was then that a servant materialized at his elbow, bearing a tray of what appeared to be tiny, gilded pastries shaped like hedgehogs. "My lord," the servant murmured, "His Grace requests your presence at the high table." Reginald's stomach, already uneasy at the sight of the peacock's reproachful stare, gave a nervous lurch. The high table, where the most important, most scrutinized guests sat, where every misstep would be witnessed by the entire court, where, he now realized with dawning horror, the chairs were upholstered in what looked like velvet, but was probably something far more expensive and impractical. He took a deep breath, adjusted his tabard, and prepared to step forward, just as one of the stilt-walking jesters lost his balance and toppled directly into the peacock pie. The resulting chaos, screaming nobles, flailing limbs, and an impressive spray of roasted bird flesh, was, in hindsight, the perfect distraction. No one noticed as Reginald, ever the survivor, quietly sidestepped the disaster and made his way toward the high table, where the Duke awaited with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was going to be a long evening. Chapter 4. The First Sip of Doom. The high table was a fortress of privilege, its occupants surveying the lesser guests with the detached amusement of gods observing particularly clumsy mortals. Sir Reginald, newly installed among these lofty ranks, felt about as comfortable as a hedgehog in a pillow fight. His armor, polished to an unnatural sheen, reflected the flickering candlelight in a way that made him look like a misplaced disco ball. The Duke, seated at the center of the table like a spider in a gilded web, raised a jewel-encrusted goblet in greeting. "Ah, Sir Reginald of the muddy boots, was it?" The Duke's smile was perfectly calibrated to convey both welcome and subtle mockery. "How delightful that you could join us. I do hope you're enjoying the festivities." Reginald, who had been silently calculating how many steps it would take to reach the nearest exit, forced a smile of his own. "The banquet is magnificent, Your Grace. I've never seen Peacock look so alive." This earned a titter of laughter from the surrounding nobles, though whether they were laughing with him or at him remained unclear. A servant materialized at his elbow, presenting a goblet of wine so dark it was practically black. The liquid swirled ominously, as if aware of its own malevolence. Now, it must be said that Sir Reginald was not a man of refined tastes. His usual drink of choice was whatever murky ale didn't have visible things floating in it. But under the Duke's expectant gaze, he had little choice but to accept the goblet with what he hoped passed for aristocratic grace. He took a hearty swig, the wine hitting his tongue with a flavor that could only be described as regret aged in a barrel of poor decisions. Unbeknownst to him, the wine had been meant for Lord Percival, the Duke's chief rival, and a man whose ongoing good health had become something of an inconvenience. The laxative slipped into the drink by the Duke's personal alchemist was a concoction of legendary potency, designed to ensure that Lord Percival would spend the rest of the evening, and possibly the next week, in intimate communion with the castle's garderobe. Reginald, blissfully unaware of this, wiped his mouth with the back of his gauntlet and nodded approvingly. "Bold," he declared, as if he had any frame of reference for fine wine. "Very earthy." The Duke's smile faltered for just a moment as he realized his mistake. His eyes flicked between Reginald and Lord Percival, who was currently engrossed in a debate about the merits of importing exotic cheeses. A muscle in the Duke's jaw twitched, but he recovered swiftly. "Indeed," he murmured. "Do enjoy it, Sir Reginald. It's a rare vintage." Rare, and about to become considerably rarer once its effects became apparent. For the first few minutes, nothing seemed amiss. Reginald nibbled on a gilded pastry that tasted primarily of crushed dreams and gold leaf, exchanging pleasantries with a baroness whose towering headdress kept blocking his view of the Jester still embedded in the peacock pie. Then, just as the minstrel began a particularly off-key rendition of the Ballad of the Dukes, unparalleled wisdom, Reginald felt it. A faint but insistent gurgle deep in his abdomen. He shifted in his seat, dismissing it as nerves. Perhaps the armor was pinching something vital. Or maybe the peacock had been staring at him with cursed, judgmental eyes. But then the gurgle escalated into something more assertive. A sensation not unlike a small but determined badger attempting to dig its way out of his intestines. Reginald's grip on the goblet tightened. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though the hall was cool. He tried to focus on the Baroness' monologue about her collection of scented candles, but his body had other priorities. The laxative, now fully active in his system, was making its presence known with the subtlety of a war horn. Across the table, the Duke watched with the faintest glimmer of alarm. This was not part of the plan. Lord Percival was supposed to be the one fleeing the hall in disgrace, not this hapless knight who had somehow stumbled into the crossfire of courtly intrigue. Reginald, meanwhile, was engaged in a heroic battle of willpower against his own digestive tract. He crossed his legs with the careful precision of a man defusing a bomb. He tried to think unappealing thoughts, taxes, cold porridge, the sound of Hubert sneezing, but his body was no longer taking orders from his brain. Then, just as the Baroness reached the thrilling climax of her candle anecdote, disaster struck. A noise emerged from the general vicinity of Reginald's armor. It was not loud, but in the momentary lull of conversation, it was unmistakable. A deep, resonant blorp, that echoed faintly against the metal plates. The Baroness paused mid-sentence. The Duke's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Even the chickens being juggled by the stilt-walker seemed to pause in mid-air. Reginald's face burned hotter than a blacksmith's forge. "Ah," he said weakly. "Must have been the chair. No one bought it." Then, as if in cruel mockery of his predicament, the armor chose that moment to betray him fully. The finely polished plates, so carefully fitted by Hubert, had one fatal flaw. They amplified everything. What should have been a discreet, if unfortunate, bodily function became instead a symphony of internal distress, each new sound reverberating through the hall like a herald announcing the arrival of shame. The Duke closed his eyes briefly, as if praying for strength. The Baroness discreetly fanned herself with a napkin. Lord Percival, entirely unaware of his narrow escape, took a hearty bite of peacock and declared it surprisingly tender. Reginald, realizing that his honor, and possibly his pants, were now in grave peril, made a desperate decision. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the marble. "Your Grace," he croaked, "if you'll excuse me, I just remembered. Nightly things." Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode, as much as a man in full armor clutching his backside could stride, toward the nearest exit. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before a very embarrassed Moses. Behind him, the Duke sighed and signaled for a servant to fetch the alchemist. There would be words. As for Reginald, his immediate future involved a frantic search for the nearest garderobe, a reassessment of his life choices, and the grim realization that no amount of polishing would ever erase this night from memory. But that, of course, was only the beginning of his troubles. Chapter 5. The Unruly Bowels. Sir Reginald's retreat from the banquet hall had all the grace of a wounded boar fleeing a hunting party. Each step sent fresh waves of agony through his beleaguered digestive tract, the armor amplifying every gurgle and groan into what sounded like a small but angry demon attempting to escape a tin cupboard. The castle corridors, which had seemed so grand upon his arrival, now stretched before him like a gauntlet designed by a particularly sadistic architect. Every turn promised relief. Every corner revealed only more flickering torches and tapestries depicting historical figures who, Reginald was certain, had never experienced this particular brand of humiliation. His internal monologue had taken a sharp turn toward the frantic. He thought desperately. I can blame it on the armor. Yes, the metal is simply settling. Perfectly normal. Happens all the time. Why, just last week, Sir Godfrey's breastplate sang an entire Gregorian chant during Vespers. But no amount of mental bargaining could disguise the truth. His body had become a traitorous vessel of betrayal, and the mutiny was worsening by the second. A servant carrying a tray of delicate pastries rounded the corner, and froze at the sight of the sweating, red-faced knight, clutching his abdomen like a man trying to physically restrain his own innards. Reginald attempted a smile which came out as more of a grimace. "Garderobe," he croaked. The servant, displaying the instincts of someone who had survived years of noble employment, pointed wordlessly down the hall, and then hurried away without looking back. Reginald lurched forward, his armor clanking with each agonizing step. The castle's layout, which had seemed straightforward enough earlier, now felt like a labyrinth designed to mock him. Was that the same tapestry of Duke Florian's great-grandfather he'd passed 3 times now? Had the suits of armor lining the hall shifted positions when he wasn't looking? Then, like a beacon of hope in a storm-tossed sea, he saw it. A small, unassuming door with a discreet carving of a relieved-looking cherub above it. The garderobe. Salvation Puntpesi, Nilvudjanane Simplestan, under Bartelsinigideka Boktamis, other word. Salvation Ben. Reginald reached for the handle, just as another cramp seized him with the force of a siege engine. He doubled over, his helmet slamming into the door with a resonant clanging. From within, A startled voice yelped. "Occupied." "No, don't be." "No, no, no." Sir Reginald pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the door and tried to remember the tenets of knightly patience. Dignity. Not soiling oneself in a duke's castle. Violetta, he suspected, was implied. From behind the door came the unmistakable sounds of someone taking their sweet, leisurely time. A rustle of fabric. A contented sigh. The occasional page of parchment being turned. Reginald's vision swam. Had someone brought reading material? Was this a garderobe or a damned library? He knocked, politely at first, then with increasing desperation. "Please," he hissed through gritted teeth. "Nightly emergency." A long pause. Then, infuriatingly, nearly finished. Reginald's intestines gave a violent lurch. He clenched every muscle he possessed, a last-ditch effort to maintain some semblance of dignity. His armor, sensing weakness, chose that moment to emit a low, reverberating whine like a teakettle reaching full boil. Just as he was contemplating whether it would be worse to perish here in the hallway or attempt to find another garderobe, and likely perish en route, the door creaked open. Out stepped Lord Percival, adjusting his tunic with the air of a man who had all the time in the world. He took one look at Reginald's ashen face and raised an eyebrow. "Goodness," he said mildly. "You look like death warmed over." Reginald didn't trust himself to speak. He sidestepped Lord Percival with the precision of a man navigating a minefield, and all but fell into the garderobe, slamming the door behind him. The relief was short-lived. As he fumbled with the straps of his armor, a new horror dawned. Plate mail was not designed for quick removal. Each buckle, each strap, each carefully polished piece was now a cruel obstacle, standing between him and survival. His fingers, slick with sweat, slipped repeatedly. The gauntlets, so impressive at the banquet, now felt like traitorous shackles. Outside, Lord Percival's amused voice floated through the door. "Do knights always sound like a sinking ship when they're in distress? Or is that just you?" Reginald's reply was muffled by the clatter of greaves hitting the floor. Time lost all meaning. What followed was a battle more grueling than any he'd fought on the field. A desperate, undignified struggle against physics, biology, and the cruel irony of his own polished armor. When it was over, Reginald slumped against the wall, drained in every sense of the word. The garderobe's wooden seat had never felt so much like a throne. And then, because fate had not yet finished toying with him, he heard the unmistakable creak of the door opening. "Your squire said you might need this," came Hubert's voice, accompanied by the sound of a small vial being set on the floor just inside the door. "It's, calming for the stomach." Reginald didn't ask how Hubert had known where to find him. Some things were better left unexplored. He reached for the vial with a trembling hand, his knightly pride in tatters, but his pants, miraculously, still intact. For now. Chapter 6. The Toast of Shame. Emerging from the garderobe, like a man who had stared into the abyss and found it disturbingly moist, Sir Reginald attempted to reassemble what remained of his dignity. Hubert had thoughtfully left a damp cloth and a sprig of mint by the door, small mercies that did little to erase the memory of the past hour. The vial of stomach-calming draught had helped, at least marginally, though it left a bitter aftertaste not unlike regret and crushed herbs. Straightening his tabard, now slightly askew from his frantic armor removal, Reginald took a deep breath and prepared to re-enter the banquet hall. His plan was simple: slip in unnoticed, reclaim his seat with the quiet grace of a shadow, and pray that no one had connected the knight who fled in distress with the knight now returning in disgrace. Fat, of course, had other plans. The moment he stepped through the arched doorway, a herald's trumpet blared, a sound that startled him so thoroughly his armor emitted a high-pitched whine. Every head in the hall swiveled toward him. At the high table Duke Florian rose, his goblet raised. Ah, Sir Reginald returns, just in time for the toast. Reginald's stomach, which had been lulled into a fragile truce by Hubert's draught, gave a warning gurgle. The Duke, either oblivious or maliciously delighted, gestured for him to approach. Come, come, we were just about to honor our most distinguished guests. His smile was a masterpiece of courtly malice. Trapped, Reginald had no choice but to clank his way back to the high table, each step measured with the precision of a man walking across a frozen lake. The nobles parted before him, their expressions ranging from polite curiosity to poorly concealed amusement. Someone, likely Lord Percival, murmured, "I do hope the chairs are sturdy enough," prompting a ripple of stifled laughter. By the time Reginald reached the Duke's side, his insides were staging a full-scale revolt. The draught had bought him time, not immunity. Every breath was a calculated risk. Every shift in posture threatened disaster. Duke Florian, sensing weakness like a shark scenting blood, pressed a fresh goblet into his hand. "As our guest of honor," he declared, "it is only fitting that Sir Reginald deliver the toast." Deafening silence fell over the hall. Even the juggling jesters paused mid-toss. Reginald's grip on the goblet tightened. His mouth went dry. His stomach lurched. Somewhere deep in his soul, a small voice whispered, "You could just faint right now. It would solve everything." But knights did not faint. Knights endured. Knights persevered. Knights, it turned out, also improvised. Clearing his throat, a sound that echoed through the hall like a dying frog, Reginald raised his goblet. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice strained but steady, "we gather tonight in the spirit of fellowship." A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. "And in honor of our most gracious host, Duke Florian, whose generosity is matched only by his impeccable taste in wine." This earned a few chuckles, though whether at the compliment or at the way Reginald's left leg had begun to tremble was unclear. He pressed on, each word a battle. "Let us raise our glasses to health, to prosperity, and to—" A sudden cramp nearly doubled him over. He locked his knees, his free hand gripping the edge of the table with white-knuckled intensity. "To the bonds that unite us all." The nobles, oblivious to his internal plight, raised their goblets in unison. "Hear, hear." Reginald, now swaying slightly, managed a sip of wine, just enough to wet his lips without further provoking the beast in his gut. But as the crowd drank, the Duke leaned in, his voice a whisper. "A fine speech, Sir Reginald. Though you seem tense. Perhaps the evening's fare disagrees with you." The knowing glint in the Duke's eye confirmed Reginald's worst suspicion. This had been intentional. The wrong goblet, the forced toast, the smug satisfaction of watching him squirm. It was all a game. A game Reginald was losing spectacularly. Just as he opened his mouth to reply, whether with a cutting remark or a plea for mercy, even he didn't know, his body made the decision for him. A sound emerged, low and resonant, like a distant avalanche. The hall fell silent once more. Reginald's face burned. The Duke's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. And then, from somewhere in the back, a voice piped up. "By the gods! Was that the Larmor again?" Laughter erupted, swift and merciless. Reginald, caught between fury and utter humiliation, did the only thing he could. He raised his goblet higher, forced a smile, and said, "A knight's armor is ever his loyal companion, even in song." The laughter redoubled. The Duke, torn between irritation and reluctant amusement, clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that nearly toppled Reginald's precarious balance. As the banquet resumed, the moment faded into the general revelry. But Reginald knew one thing for certain: revenge would be his, just as soon as he located another garderobe. Chapter 7. The Ill-Fated Retreat. Sir Reginald's grip on the edge of the banquet table turned his knuckles a pale shade of desperation. The hall swam before him in a dizzying carousel of candlelight, laughter, and the ever-present judgmental gaze of the reconstructed peacock centerpiece. Every fiber of his being screamed for retreat, but a knight's dignity, what little remained of it, demanded he withdraw with at least a semblance of decorum. He straightened his back with a metallic creak that sounded suspiciously like a poorly maintained drawbridge. The Duke, still basking in the afterglow of his successful humiliation, had mercifully turned his attention to berating a servant about the temperature of the roasted swan. Reginald cites this moment of distraction to begin his escape. He took a careful step backward, then another, moving with the exaggerated caution of a man navigating a floor made entirely of eggshells. His armor, which had been polished to a mirror finish earlier that evening, now reflected the pitying smirks of nearby nobles, like some cruel, convex mirror of shame. His path to the exit was clear save for 3 obstacles. A gaggle of giggling noblewomen clustered around the spiced wine fountain, a particularly wide section of marble floor polished to glass-like perfection, and the remains of the unfortunate stilt-walking Jester, who had earlier become one with the peacock pie. Reginald's stomach gave a warning gurgle as he contemplated this gauntlet of hazards. He adjusted his posture to what he hoped looked like casual nonchalance rather than a man desperately clenching his buttocks, and began his perilous journey. The noblewomen proved easier to bypass than anticipated, their attention thoroughly captured by some scandalous bit of gossip involving a baron and a misplaced codpiece. Reginald slipped past them with only minimal armor clanking, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. The polished marble, however, presented a more formidable challenge. As his boot made contact with the slick surface, his legs immediately adopted the ungainly posture of a newborn fawn on an ice rink. His arms windmilled wildly, sending his empty goblet clattering across the floor in a series of echoing metallic shrieks that drew every eye in the hall. Somehow, miraculously, he maintained his footing. The crowd, sensing fresh entertainment, began murmuring excitedly. Reginald could feel the weight of their anticipation pressing on him like an ill-fitted breastplate. He forced a weak chuckle that sounded more like a strangled hiccup and pressed onward, only to freeze mid-step as an altogether new and more urgent crisis announced itself. The Duke's special wine was staging a violent revolt in his digestive tract, demanding immediate evacuation. Sweat beaded on Reginald's forehead as he performed a rapid mental calculation of distance versus dignity. The exit loomed perhaps 20 paces away. His body suggested he had perhaps 5 paces worth of time remaining. Compromise was necessary. Adopting what he hoped looked like a thoughtful, measured stride rather than a panicked waddle, he resumed his journey with renewed determination. But, never kind to Sir Reginald, chose this moment to introduce the final obstacle. The fallen Jester, having extricated himself from the ruins of the peacock pie, rose from his seat on the floor directly in Reginald's path. His motley was ruined, his bells silent with pie filling, but his sense of mischief remained intact. "Good Sir Knight," he proclaimed with a sweeping bow that somehow managed to be both mocking and graceful, "might I interest you in Whatever the Jester might have offered was lost to history as Reginald's body made the executive decision that ceremony was no longer a priority. A sound emerged from somewhere in the vicinity of his armor, a sound that began as a low moan and crescendoed into something resembling a foghorn being played through a tuba. The hall fell silent. The Jester's eyes widened. In that terrible, endless moment, Sir Reginald of the Muddy Boots made peace with his fate. There would be no dignified retreat. There would be no salvaging his reputation. There was only the now, the all-consuming now, and the overwhelming need to be elsewhere with extreme prejudice. With a strangled cry that might have been a prayer or a curse, Reginald abandoned all pretense of dignity and broke into a shuffling, armor-clanking sprint toward the exit. His cape fluttered behind him like a battle standard of surrender, His greaves clashed against the marble with a rhythm of impending disaster, and somewhere in the chaos, the Duke's laughter rang out like the tolling of a funeral bell. The last thing the banquet guests saw as Reginald disappeared through the archway was the unmistakable glint of moonlight, reflecting off something metallic that definitely shouldn't have been visible beneath a knight's armor. The scandal would fuel court gossip for months. But for Sir Reginald, racing through the castle corridors with the single-minded focus of a siege engine, there was only one thought that mattered. Never again would he accept an invitation from Duke Florian the Festive. Assuming, of course, he survived the night. Chapter 8. The Collapsing Codpiece. Sir Reginald had faced many terrors in his time: the ravenous goose of Brackenford, the suspiciously sentient porridge at the Battle of Milford, the time he discovered too late that his squire had polished his armor with bacon grease. But none compared to the sheer, bowel-loosening horror of realizing his codpiece was about to fail. The desperate sprint through the castle corridors had been ill-advised from the start. The polished marble floors, treacherous at the best of times, became outright hostile when combined with the frantic, bow-legged gait of a man who could no longer fully trust his own anatomy. Each pounding step sent vibrations through his armor, loosening straps already strained from his earlier garderobe emergency. The codpiece, a once proud, somewhat ostentatious piece of plate designed to imply knightly virility, had begun to rattle ominously, its hinges creaking like a haunted drawbridge. Reginald skidded around a corner, his greaves screeching against stone, and came face to face with a half-dozen servants carrying an enormous roasted boar on a litter. Their eyes widened in unison as he careened toward them, arms pinwheeling, codpiece clanking like a loose shutter in a windstorm. "Out of my way," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. The servants, trained in the art of avoiding noble disasters, scattered like leaves before a storm. The boar, however, remained resolutely in place. Reginald attempted a leap that, under normal circumstances, might have been impressive. These were not normal circumstances. His foot caught on the boar's crisp ear, sending him into a flailing arc that ended with a full-body clang against a suit of ornamental armor. The impact reverberated through him like a church bell, and somewhere in the chaos, a metallic yeegy pinging signaled the final failure of his dignity's last bastion. The codpiece hit the ground with a sound like a dropped chalice, rolling in a lazy semicircle before coming to rest at the feet of a passing nun. Silence fell. The nun looked down. Reginald, sprawled in a tangle of his own limbs and the now disassembled ornamental armor, looked up. Their eyes met. "Oh," said the nun. Reginald had never before envied the dead, but as he lay there, his most vulnerable regions exposed to both the elements and the judgmental gaze of a woman of the cloth, he found himself yearning for the sweet oblivion of the grave. The servants, to their credit, attempted to pretend they hadn't seen anything, though one young page's poorly suppressed giggles suggested this particular story would be retold in the kitchens for generations. The nun, displaying a level of composure that Reginald could only marvel at, bent down, picked up the codpiece between two fingers as though it were a particularly questionable relic, and handed it back to him. "I believe you dropped something, my son," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. Reginald, his face now the approximate color of fresh beetroot, snatched the offending item and attempted to reattach it with hands that shook like a drunkard's. The mechanism, however, had been irreparably damaged, and the codpiece simply dangled limply, swinging like a broken gate in the breeze. From somewhere down the hall came the unmistakable sound of the Duke's laughter, growing closer by the second. Reginald's survival instincts, battered though they were, kicked in. Clutching the codpiece to his chest like a shameful secret, he scrambled upright and resumed his flight, leaving behind the ruined boar, the stunned servants, and what little remained of his honor. The castle, it seemed, had no shortage of witnesses to his humiliation. A pair of giggling chambermaids ducked into an alcove as he passed. A stoic guardsman averted his eyes with such intensity he might have been trying to unsee the sun itself. Even the castle cats paused in their rodent hunting to stare at him with undisguised feline judgment. At last Reginald found himself before a door, plain, unadorned, and most importantly, unoccupied. He wrenched it open without checking its purpose and stumbled through, slamming it behind him with enough force to rattle the hinges. Darkness enveloped him. Blessed, merciful darkness. Then, from the shadows, came a dry cough. Reginald froze. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to the dim light of a single candle, revealing a small, cluttered room, and the Duke's personal alchemist perched on a stool and blinking at him in surprise. Between them sat a bubbling cauldron of viscous liquid that smelled alarmingly like Reginald's current predicament. The alchemist looked Reginald up and down, taking in the disheveled armor, the dangling codpiece, the wild-eyed desperation. Then, without a word, he reached into his robes and produced a small bottle filled with murky green liquid. "For the stomach," he said. "Stronger than the last one." Reginald, beyond pride, beyond shame, took the bottle and drank. It tasted like defeat and grass. Mostly grass. But that, as they say, is another story. Chapter 9. The court's roaring laughter. Back in the banquet hall, the Duke wiped tears of mirth from his eyes as the 12th retelling of Sir Reginald's misfortune reached his ears. Each version grew more elaborate than the last. Some claimed the knight had been chased by his own rebellious armor. Others swore they'd seen the codpiece sprout wings and fly out a window. The truth hardly mattered anymore. What mattered was the glorious, unrelenting spectacle of it all. At the high table, Lord Percival nearly choked on his wine as a particularly imaginative account reached its climax. And then, gasped the storyteller, a young page who had clearly missed his calling as a bard, Sir Reginald's greaves turned against him. They locked around his ankles and began waltzing. The crowd roared, their laughter shaking the very rafters. Even the stoic guards stationed along the walls cracked smiles, their stern professionalism crumbling under the weight of collective glee. The Duke, ever the gracious host, raised his goblet. "A toast!" he declared, his voice cutting through the merriment. "To Sir Reginald of the—" He paused, savoring the moment. "Unfettered valor." The hall erupted anew. Goblets clashed together, wine sloshed onto the fine linen tablecloths, and somewhere in the chaos, a jester began composing what would later become the infamous Ballad of the bare-knighted blundery. Meanwhile the servants, those invisible, ever-efficient ghosts of the castle, whispered among themselves as they cleared the ruined peacock pie and righted toppled chair. Their laughter was quieter but no less genuine. The kitchen boy who had witnessed the codpiece's dramatic escape pantomimed the event with a ladle and a bread roll, much to the cook's exasperated amusement. Only the nun who had borne witness to Reginald's lowest moment remained solemn, though the twitch at the corner of her mouth suggested even her piety struggled against the tide of universal hilarity. She sipped her watered wine and offered a silent prayer. For Sir Reginald's soul, or perhaps for the strength not to laugh, it was impossible to say. As the night wore on, the stories grew wilder. Some claimed Reginald had been cursed by a witch, others that he'd angered the castle's resident ghost. A particularly drunk baron insisted he'd seen the whole thing coming, citing the ominous way the knight had buttered his bread earlier that evening. The Duke, delighted by the sheer creativity of his guests, awarded a prize of 10 gold coins to whoever could invent the most outlandish explanation. A decision that would later be blamed for the infamous werewolf codpiece conspiracy that plagued the court for months. Through it all, the laughter never ceased. It echoed through the halls, seeped into the tapestries, and would linger in the castle's stones for years to come. For one glorious night, Sir Reginald of the Muddy Boots had achieved what no other knight could claim. He had united the entire court in perfect, unbridled joy. And as for the man himself, well, that is a tale for another chapter. Chapter 10. The Jester's Ballad. The banquet hall still buzzed with laughter when the Duke's chief jester, a wiry man with bells sewn into his ridiculous hat, climbed atop one of the less sticky tables and cleared his throat with a theatrical flourish. The crowd fell silent in anticipation. Nothing pleased nobility more than watching someone else be publicly humiliated through song. The jester plucked a single dramatic chord from his lute, letting it hang in the air like the last shred of Sir Reginald's dignity. "Oh, gather round and lend an ear," he began in a lilting sing-song voice that carried to every corner of the hall, "to hear of knightly woe and fear." His fingers danced across the lute strings as he swayed precariously, his bells jingling with each movement. The noble guests leaned forward, their faces alight with cruel delight. The jester's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper for the next verse. A mighty knight in armor bright came to feast with great delight. He paused, letting the audience savor what they knew was coming. But woe, alack, what tragic fate! The wine he drank would not digestate. The crowd roared with laughter as the jester mimed drinking from a goblet, then clutched his stomach in exaggerated agony. Each verse grew more outrageous than the last. The jester pranced about the table, acting out Sir Reginald's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain composure. He mimicked the knight's stiff-legged walk, his horrified realization, and finally, to uproarious applause, reenacted the moment of the codpiece's betrayal with a well-timed flick of his wrist that sent a wooden cup clattering across the floor. The Duke laughed so hard he nearly choked on his wine, pounding the table with one hand while wiping tears from his eyes with the other. Lady Eleanor actually snorted into her handkerchief, an unthinkable breach of decorum that would normally have scandalized the court. But tonight merely added to the general merriment. Even the normally somber archbishop chuckled into his beard, though he did make the sign of the holy symbol afterward, as if to apologize for enjoying another's misfortune. The jester reached his crescendo with a dramatic leap from the table, landing in a crouch with his arms spread wide. And thus our tale comes to its end, of knightly pride and armor's bend. He strummed a final chord, then bowed so low his hat nearly toppled from his head. Remember well this woeful sight, never trust a duke's invite. The hall erupted. Coins rained down around the jester as noble after noble tossed their appreciation. The song, crude as it was, had perfectly captured the evening's absurdity in a way that would ensure the story lived on for generations. Already, servants at the edges of the room could be seen committing the lyrics to memory, knowing this ballad would be requested in taverns across the land before the week was out. From his hiding spot in the alchemist's closet, Sir Reginald could hear every word through the thick wooden door. Each verse struck him like a physical blow, driving home the inescapable truth. By sunrise, his shame would be immortalized in song. His only consolation was that the alchemist's latest concoction had finally begun working its magic, though whether the warm feeling in his stomach was the medicine or the last vestiges of his pride dissolving, he couldn't be certain. Back in the hall, the jester took his bows, then launched into an encore verse about the nun's reaction that had the crowd howling anew. The Duke, still gasping with laughter, signaled for his scribe. "Record those lyrics exactly," he wheezed between chuckles. "I want them copied and distributed to every noble house by month's end." The scribe nodded, already scratching away at his parchment with a grin of his own. As the song ended and the banquet began to wind down, guests could be heard humming the catchy tune to themselves. The melody was simple but infectious, the kind that would stick in one's head for days. The legend of Sir Reginald and his unfortunate armor had officially passed from embarrassing incident to immortal comedy, preserved forever in the jester's merciless ballad. And somewhere in the castle, a single discarded codpiece lay forgotten in a shadowed corner, its brief moment of notoriety at an end. But the song would live on. Chapter 11. The Duke's False Sympathy. The alchemist's draught had finally worked its magic, settling Sir Reginald's rebellious stomach, but doing nothing for his wounded pride. As he emerged from the cluttered workshop, his armor hastily reassembled in a manner that might charitably be called functional, he nearly collided with Duke Florian himself. The Duke's timing was, as always, impeccable. His face arranged itself into an expression of concerned sympathy that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "My dear Sir Reginald," the Duke purred, placing a jeweled hand on the knight's pauldron with the careful delicacy one might use to pet a rabid dog. "What an unfortunate series of events." His mouth twitched at the corners, betraying the laughter he struggled to contain. "I do hope you're feeling better." Reginald's jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. The Duke's perfume. An overwhelming musk of rose oil and something distinctly feline filled his nostrils, making his already unsettled stomach lurch anew. "Your Grace is too kind," he ground out, forcing the words past his lips like a man swallowing broken glass. "A passing malaise, nothing more." The Duke's eyebrows arched with theatrical concern. He leaned closer, his breath warm against Reginald's ear. Of course, though I must say your performance at the toast was memorable." He drew back with a smile that could have curdled milk. "Positively inspired. I haven't seen a man so dedicated to his craft since the court acrobat lost his breeches during the summer solstice celebration." A hot flush crept up Reginald's neck, no doubt turning his face the same shade as the Duke's prized rubies. Around them, servants pretended not to listen while straining to catch every word. Somewhere in the distance, the faint strains of the Jester's mocking ballad still echoed through the stone corridors. "The wine," Reginald began, then hesitated. Accusing his host of poisoning, even with something as relatively benign as a laxative, was beyond the pale, even in his current state of humiliation. "The wine must have disagreed with me." The Duke's eyes sparkled with malicious delight. "Ah, yes, the wine. A rare vintage from my southern vineyards. Quite potent stuff." He patted Reginald's armored shoulder again, the clang of metal on rings echoing through the hallway. "Perhaps your knightly constitution isn't what it once was. Age comes for us all, even the mightiest warriors." Every word dripped with false concern, each syllable carefully crafted to twist the knife while maintaining plausible deniability. The Duke was a master of this particular game, and Reginald knew himself outmatched. His fingers twitched toward his sword hilt before he remembered that murdering one's host, no matter how richly deserved, was generally frowned upon in courtly circles. "I shall take my leave, Your Grace," Reginald managed through gritted teeth. "The hour grows late, and I wouldn't wish to—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence without inviting fresh humiliation. The Duke waved an airy hand, his rings catching the torchlight in dazzling flashes. Of course. Do give my regards to your squire." The boy showed remarkable restraint during tonight's festivities. The unspoken implication hung between them like an executioner's axe. Hubert had probably been the only person in the castle not laughing at his master's expense. As Reginald turned to leave, the Duke called after him in a voice sweet as poisoned honey. "We must do this again soon. Perhaps next time you'll grace us with a demonstration of your famous jousting skills? Unless," he added with a sly wink, "you're worried your armor might have other ideas." The laughter followed Reginald down the corridor, nipping at his heels like a pack of hungry hounds. His armor, which had been polished to a mirror shine that morning, now seemed dull and ill-fitting, each plate a reminder of the evening's disasters. The distant echo of the Jester's song, now being drunkenly bellowed by what sounded like half the court, chased him all the way to the stables, where his long-suffering horse greeted him with what might have been sympathy or simple equine indifference. As he rode through the castle gates into the merciful darkness of night, one thought burned brighter than all others in Sir Reginald's mind: revenge. Sweet, elaborate, and above all, humiliating revenge against Duke Florian the Fastidious. It might take months. It might take years. But it would come. The night's events would not soon be forgotten. But neither, Reginald vowed, would the Duke's Comeuppance. And when it arrived, the entire court would bear witness, preferably while wearing very insecure trousers. Chapter 12. The Walk of Infamy. The banquet hall stretched before Sir Reginald like a gauntlet designed by a particularly sadistic deity. Every clanking step of his hastily reattached armor echoed through the suddenly silent chamber, the once roaring laughter now reduced to muffled giggles and poorly concealed whispers. His codpiece, though technically secured, hung at a slightly off angle that somehow drew more attention than if it had fallen off completely. The alchemist's potion had quelled his rebellious stomach, but nothing could quell the rising tide of humiliation that burned his ears crimson. From his elevated seat at the high table, Duke Florian made a show of rising with exaggerated concern. "Ah, Sir Reginald returns to us." His voice carried across the hall with practiced ease. "We feared you'd been carried off by whatever foul humors plagued you earlier." The delicate pause before foul humors was masterfully executed, drawing fresh titters from the assembled nobles. Reginald kept his gaze fixed on the far doors, willing them closer through sheer force of will. The distance seemed to grow with each step rather than shrink, the polished marble floor stretching before him like a frozen lake. To his horror, he realized someone had placed fresh rose petals along his path. Whether as some cruel joke or misguided attempt at honor, he couldn't tell. Their delicate fragrance mixed unpleasantly with the lingering scent of roasted meats and his own nervous sweat trapped inside his armor. Lady Eleonora, of the piercing blue eyes and razor-sharp tongue, leaned toward her companion as Reginald passed. "They say the armor makes the man," she murmured, just loud enough to carry. "In this case, it appears to be making a break for freedom." Her companion snorted wine through his nose, the resulting spray barely missing Reginald's already compromised greaves. Near the musicians' gallery, a group of pages had begun a quiet but unmistakable rhythmic clapping, the same cadence as the Jester's mocking ballad from earlier. The tune had clearly taken root in the castle's collective consciousness with terrifying speed. Reginald's jaw ached from how tightly he clenched it, his teeth grinding together with enough force to pulverize stone. At the halfway point, his ordeal took a fresh turn for the worse. The same stilt-walking Jester, who had earlier become one with the peacock pie, now descended from the rafters on some sort of pulley system, dangling directly in Reginald's path. The fool's exaggerated codpiece, easily 3 times the normal size and stuffed with what appeared to be jingling bells, swung precariously as he executed a mid-air bow. "Make way for the knight of the unfettered loinplate," the Jester proclaimed, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. A shower of flower petals rained down from somewhere above, several sticking to the sweat on Reginald's forehead. The crowd's laughter surged anew, a wave of sound that threatened to knock him from his feet more effectively than any battlefield opponent ever had. Reginald's hand twitched toward his sword before he remembered that cutting down the Duke's favorite Jester would only compound his troubles. Instead, he attempted to step around the dangling nuisance, only to feel something give way beneath his foot with a sickening crunch. Looking down, he discovered he'd trodden upon one of the decorative sugar sculptures, a delicate rendering of the Duke's crest that now lay in ruins beneath his boot. The symbolism was almost too perfect. From the high table came the Duke's booming voice. "Really, Sir Reginald, must you trample our humble offerings as well as our dignity?" This elicited the loudest laugh yet, several nobles actually pounding their goblets on the tables in appreciation of their host's wit. The final 10 paces to the door were the longest of Reginald's life. Each step echoed like a death knell, his armor amplifying every sound until he felt less like a knight and more like a walking kitchen accident. The whispers followed him like a persistent fog. "Did you see?" they said actually. "I heard it went clean through." As his hand finally closed on the door's wrought iron handle, a final indignity awaited. Someone, likely the same clever soul behind the rose petals, had hung a wreath of laurels around the exit. Not the traditional symbol of victory, but rather a crude imitation woven from what appeared to be undergarments. The message was clear. This was no triumphant departure. The doors swung shut behind him with satisfying finality, cutting off the hall's laughter like a guillotine severing a head. But Reginald knew the sound would haunt him for years to come, just as he knew this night would live on in song and story long after he'd gone to his grave. Somewhere in the distance, he could already hear the faint strains of the Jester's tune being picked up by the castle's servants, the infectious melody spreading through the stone corridors like the plague. His squire Hubert waited in the courtyard, holding the reins of their horses with an expression of carefully cultivated neutrality. The boy's eyes flickered briefly to his master's armor, particularly the suspiciously angled codpiece, before fixing resolutely on the middle distance. For this small mercy, Reginald could have kissed him. "Home, Hubert," Reginald growled as he hauled himself into the saddle with considerably less grace than usual. The word had never sounded so sweet, nor so distant. The castle gates loomed ahead, their iron spikes silhouetted against the moonlit sky like teeth waiting to bite. Beyond lay the long road home, and the beginning of what would surely be a legendary quest for vengeance. But first, Reginald decided as his horse plodded forward, he would need to commission new armor, and perhaps invest in some very sturdy undergarments. Chapter 13. The Stable Boy's Kindness. The cold night air bit through the gaps in Sir Reginald's battered armor as he emerged from the castle's rear entrance, his breath coming in short, angry puffs of mist. The courtyard was mercifully empty save for Hubert and the horses, their breath steaming in the chill. The squire had at least managed to secure Buttercup and prepare her for travel, though his eyes remained fixed on the ground as if the cobblestones held the secrets of the universe. Reginald opened his mouth to bark an order when movement caught his eye. A small, grime-streaked stable boy, no older than 12, darting from the shadows of the tack room. The child clutched a bundle of rough spun fabric to his chest, his cheeks flushed with either cold or nerves. He skidded to a halt a few feet from the knight, eyes wide but determined. "My lord," the boy mumbled, thrusting the bundle forward without meeting Reginald's gaze. "For the road." Reginald stared. It was a cloak, a patched, frayed, and slightly horse-scented cloak, but a cloak nonetheless. The wool was coarse and thin in places, clearly mended several times over, but it had been freshly brushed and neatly folded. Peasant's garment, offered without ceremony or expectation. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant echo of laughter still spilling from the banquet hall. Reginald's first instinct was to refuse. What use did a knight have for a stable boy's cast-offs? But then the wind cut through him again, rattling his loose armor plates, and the absurdity of his pride struck him like a blow. He took the cloak. The boy nodded once, quick and jerky, then turned to flee back into the shadows. But Reginald stopped him with a word. "Wait." The child froze like a rabbit, scenting a wolf. Reginald fumbled at his belt, fingers numb with cold and lingering humiliation. After a moment he produced a single silver coin, hardly a fortune, but likely more than the boy saw in a month. He pressed it into the child's grubby palm. "For your trouble." The boy's eyes widened further, his fingers closing around the coin with something akin to reverence. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he bowed, a clumsy, unpracticed motion, and vanished into the stable's gloom. Hubert, who had witnessed the exchange in silence, finally risked a glance at his master. "Shall we ride, sir?" Reginald swung the cloak around his shoulders. It was too short, the hem barely reached his thighs, and smelled distinctly of hay and damp dog. But it was warm. And, more importantly, it covered the worst of his armor's indignities. "We ride," he grunted, hauling himself into the saddle with a clatter of ill-fitting plate. As they passed through the castle gates, the raucous strains of the Jester's song followed them into the night. But beneath the rough wool cloak, Sir Reginald found a small, unexpected ember of warmth, not just from the fabric, but from the memory of the stable boy's face as he clutched that single silver coin. Mercy, it seemed, still existed in the world, even if it had to come from the lowest of places. The road ahead was long, and vengeance would take time. But for now, at least, he was no longer cold. Chapter 14. The Midnight Escape. The castle gates creaked shut behind them, with a finality that echoed in Sir Reginald's bones. The cold night air smelled of damp earth and freedom as Buttercup plodded along the muddy road, her hooves making soft, sucking sounds in the muck. The stable boy's cloak flapped about Reginald's thighs, too short to be proper, but enough to cover the worst of his armor's indignities. Behind them, the Duke's fortress loomed against the starless sky, its torches flickering like mocking eyes. Hubert rode a pace behind, his usual chatter replaced by a silence that spoke volume. The squire had witnessed everything: the disastrous toast, the failed codpiece, the walk of shame through the banquet hall, and yet he'd said nothing. No jokes, no awkward attempts at comfort. Just that quiet, steady presence as they gathered their things and fled into the night. Reginald wasn't sure if he wanted to thank the boy or strangle him for his discretion. The road dipped into a shallow valley, the castle vanishing behind a screen of skeletal trees. Still, Reginald kept glancing back, half expecting to see the Duke's men charging after them with torches and fresh humiliation. But there was nothing, only the wind and the occasional hoot of an owl. "They won't follow," Hubert said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. The Duke got what he wanted. Reginald's gauntlets creaked as he tightened his grip on the reins. He knew Hubert was right. The Duke had orchestrated the entire evening like a master puppeteer, and now Reginald's disgrace would spread through the kingdom faster than the plague. By dawn, the Jester's song would be on every minstrel's lips. By week's end, even peasant children would be giggling about the knight who lost his pants at a banquet. Buttercup snorted, her ears flicking at some unseen night creature. The sound pulled Reginald from his thoughts. Ahead the road forked, one path winding east toward home, the other north into lands unknown. Without hesitation, he guided Buttercup onto the northern trail. Hubert made a small noise of surprise. "Sir, the manor is—" "I know where the damned manor is," Reginald growled. He took a breath, forcing his voice level. "We're not going back. Not yet. Not until he'd salvaged something from this wreckage. Not until he could face his household without seeing the same suppressed laughter that had haunted him through the banquet hall." The moon broke through the clouds then, casting pale light over the unfamiliar path ahead. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely, aching sound that matched the turmoil in Reginald's chest. He squared his shoulders beneath the ill-fitting cloak and rode on. The night swallowed them whole. Chapter 15. The Legend Spreads. By the time the sun rose over Duke Florian's castle, the story had already escaped its walls like a lively stench from the garderobes. The kitchen maids whispered it to the milkmaids, who sang it to the shepherds driving their flocks to pasture. The guards at the gate, still chuckling from their night's entertainment, spread it to traveling merchants who would carry it along every trade route in the kingdom. At a roadside inn not 3 leagues from the castle, a traveling minstrel performed the Jester's ballad for his breakfast. His rendition included an elaborate dance where his own codpiece dramatically detached mid-chorus and went skipping across the tavern floor, much to the delight of the gathered farmers. By noon, 3 separate versions of the song were already circulating in the marketplace, each more exaggerated than the last. In the castle town, the baker's wife told her customers how Sir Reginald's armor had come alive and chased him through the banquet hall, shedding pieces like a snake, molting its skin. The blacksmith swore the knight had been cursed by a witch to lose everything he held dear, which the smith's apprentice helpfully clarified meant his dignity and also his trousers. By evening, children were playing a new game called Knight's Downfall, where the loser had to run through the streets clutching their backside. The Duke's scribes worked tirelessly recording every variation, their quills scratching across parchment as the legend grew more elaborate with each telling. One account claimed Sir Reginald had been simultaneously struck by food poisoning, a witch's curse, and an ill-timed sneeze. Another insisted the entire incident had been an elaborate magical duel, with the rogue codpiece as the final fatal blow. Market stalls began selling crude wooden carvings of a knight with detachable armor. Street vendors hawked knight's courage tonic, real just cheap ale with a picture of a falling codpiece on the bottle. The castle seamstress, displaying entrepreneurial spirit, started offering reinforced undergarments guaranteed to withstand even the most disastrous banquet. Back at the castle, Duke Florian received reports of the spreading legend with immense satisfaction. He commissioned a tapestry depicting the scene, though in this version he stood heroically trying to assist the flailing knight rather than laughing uproariously. When his chamberlain expressed concern that the story might reflect poorly on the dignity of knighthood in general, the Duke merely smiled and ordered commemorative medals struck. Meanwhile, on the northern road, Sir Reginald remained blissfully unaware of his growing infamy. The few travelers they passed seemed to look at him oddly, but he attributed this to his makeshift cloak and battered armor. At one point, a group of children playing near a village well suddenly scattered at his approach, giggling and shouting something about checking the buckles. Hubert grew increasingly tight-lipped with each passing mile, his eyes darting nervously to every roadside storyteller and wandering minstrel they encountered. The legend grew legs faster than a startled deer. By week's end, versions of the tale had reached neighboring duchies. In one coastal town, fishermen told of a knight whose armor had been stolen by mischievous merfolk during a banquet. In a mountain keep, the guards swore the story was about a cursed suit that abandoned its wearer mid-feast. And everywhere, always, the song followed. The damned, catchy, inescapable song. Somewhere in a quiet forest glade, as Reginald dismounted to wash his face in a cold stream, a traveling tinker's cart rattled by on a nearby road. The man's voice carried clearly through the trees, as he sang the now familiar chorus to his donkey. "Oh, mind your straps and check each latch, or else you'll meet our hero's match. For when the wine begins to flow, that's when your dignity will go." Hubert froze amid-step, his water skin slipping from suddenly numb fingers. Reginald slowly raised his dripping face from the stream, water running down his cheeks like the tears he refused to shed. A long, terrible silence stretched between them. "I think," Reginald said at last, his voice dangerously calm, "we'll avoid towns for a while." Hubert nodded vigorously, already mentally inventorying their supplies. Somewhere in the distance, the tinker's song faded away, leaving only the whisper of leaves and the first faint seeds of revenge taking root in a humiliated knight's heart. Chapter 16. The Knight's Reckoning. The fire crackled softly in the isolated forest clearing, its glow painting Sir Reginald's battered armor in flickering hues of orange and black. Hubert had long since fallen asleep, curled beneath his travel cloak like a child after a trying day. But sleep eluded the knight, his fingers absently tracing the dents and scratches in his breastplate that told the story of far nobler battles than the one he'd lost tonight. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a spray of sparks that danced briefly against the night sky before winking out. Reginald watched them fade, thinking how like reputation they were, bright one moment, gone the next. All his years of service, all his hard-won honors, reduced to ash by a single disastrous evening. He wondered if this was how Icarus felt during his long fall. Not fear, not even regret, just a dawning realization of how ridiculous it all was. The stable-boy's cloak still hung about his shoulders, smelling faintly of hay and honest labor. That boy, whose name Reginald didn't even know, had shown him more true kindness than any noble in the banquet hall. What did that say about honor? About the carefully constructed ideals he'd spent his life upholding? Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, its mournful cry echoing through the trees. Reginald absently rubbed at a wine stain on his tabard, the rich purple fabric now as tattered as his dignity. The symbols embroidered there, the crest of his house, the marks of his achievements, meant nothing to the peasants singing the damned song in every tavern, nothing to the merchants already hawking commemorative trinkets, nothing to history which would remember him not for his valor in battle, but for the moment his trousers betrayed him. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. Hubert stirred slightly, but didn't wake. The squire had stood by him through this humiliation, never laughing, never mocking, More knightly behavior, Reginald realized, than he'd shown at his angriest moments tonight. Perhaps true honor wasn't in never falling, but in how one helped others back to their feet. The fire burned lower, its warmth barely reaching Reginald's outstretched hands. Somewhere beyond these woods, the world was busy turning his shame into legend. By morning, there would be new verses to the song, new embellishments to the tale. But here, in this quiet space between sunset and dawn, there was only a man and his thoughts. Reginald sighed and leaned back against the rough bark of an oak tree. The stars glittered coldly overhead, indifferent to human notions of honor or disgrace. A lifetime of striving, only to learn how fragile reputation truly was. How absurd it all seemed now, under this vast sky. He closed his eyes at last, the stable boy's cloak pulled tight around him. Tomorrow would bring what it may, more songs, more laughter, perhaps even vengeance. But for tonight, there was only this reckoning, this quiet understanding that some defeats cut deeper than any sword. And yet, the world went on. The fire crackled. The owl called. And a knight, stripped of everything but his own weary bones, finally slept. Chapter 17. The Duke's Comeuppance. The Duke's grand hall, which had so recently rung with laughter at Sir Reginald's expense, now hosted a very different sort of gathering. The same nobles who had reveled in the night's humiliation sat in stunned silence, their goblets forgotten, their faces frozen in expressions of mingled horror and fascination. At the center of it all stood the Duke's personal alchemist, his stained robes flapping as he waved a sheaf of parchment in the air like a battle standard. It was meant for Lord Percival, the alchemist shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. He had been caught trying to flee the castle in the dead of night, his saddlebags stuffed with the Duke's silver and a remarkably detailed diary. The Duke ordered me to prepare a purgative so potent it would keep his rival from the tournament season. The knight drank it by mistake. Duke Florian, seated upon his gilded chair, had gone the color of spoiled milk. His carefully cultivated mask of amusement had slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "This is slander," he hissed, though the tremor in his voice undermined his conviction. Lord Percival, the intended victim of the plot, rose slowly from his seat. His usual air of mild boredom had been replaced by something far more dangerous. "Is that so, Your Grace?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. He reached into his doublet and produced a small vial identical to the one Sir Reginald had been given in the alchemist's closet. "Then perhaps you'd care to drink a toast with me." A gasp rippled through the assembly. The Duke's eyes darted toward the nearest exit, but the way was blocked by a wall of suddenly very serious-looking guards. It was at this precise moment that the castle's newly installed plumbing chose to rebel. A thunderous gurgle echoed through the hall, followed by an ominous dripping sound from above. The Duke's much-vaunted modern conveniences, a network of pipes meant to carry waste away from the living quarters, had become hopelessly clogged. The alchemist's various potions poured down the garderobes by servants eager to dispose of the evidence had congealed into a substance not unlike tar. The first drip landed on the Duke's shoulder with a wet plop. He stared at the yellowish stain spreading across his priceless silk brocade, his nostrils flaring in horrified recognition. More drips followed, a steady rain of foulness from the ceiling above. Nobles scrambled backward, their fine shoes slipping on the suddenly treacherous floor. Lord Percival, displaying reflexes honed by years of courtly intrigue, snapped open a fan and held it over his head. "It appears the chickens have come home to roost, Your Grace," he observed mildly. "Or perhaps I should say, everything has come home to roost." The Duke opened his mouth to respond, but what emerged was not words, but a strangled gasp. His hands flew to his stomach, his eyes widening in sudden, horrified understanding. The alchemist, seeing his opportunity, pointed an accusing finger. "He made me test all the potions on the kitchen dogs first. The small spotted one is still recovering." This revelation broke the dam. The hall erupted into chaos. Nobles tripped over each other in their haste to escape the dripping ceiling. Servants abandoned all pretense of decorum, some laughing openly as the Duke clutched his belly and made a desperate, undignified sprint for the nearest exit, the same one Sir Reginald had used in his own moment of disgrace. History, it seemed, had a sense of poetic justice. Word of the Duke's downfall spread even faster than the tales of Sir Reginald's misfortune. By nightfall, a new song could be heard in the taverns, a lively tune called the Duke's Two-Story Tragedy, which cleverly rhymed pompous with "unclog our drains at your own cost us." The alchemist, having turned over his entire ledger of the Duke's misdeeds to Lord Percival, was last seen heading south with a bag of silver and what appeared to be the beginnings of a spectacular beard. And somewhere on the northern road, a certain disgraced knight paused by a campfire as a traveling merchant relayed the latest news. Sir Reginald listened in silence, his face unreadable in the flickering light. When the tale was done, he merely nodded and tossed another log on the fire. But as the merchant rode away, Hubert swore he saw the ghost of a smile tugging at his master's lips. It faded quickly, replaced by the familiar grim determination. But for that one brief moment the scales had balanced. The road ahead remained long, but it no longer seemed quite so dark. Chapter 18. The New Life. The abandoned hermitage stood atop a windswept hill, its stone walls worn smooth by decades of storms and solitude. It had no grand tapestries, no peacock pies, and most importantly, no banquet halls. Sir Reginald stood in the doorway, the stable boy's cloak still draped over his shoulders, and knew he had found his home. Hubert hesitated behind him, shifting from foot to foot. "Are you certain about this, sir?" The squire's eyes darted to the pile of armor they'd left by the roadside, the last remnants of Reginald's old life, discarded like a snake's outgrown skin. Reginald ran a hand through his now unruly beard, longer by several weeks of travel. The absence of his breastplate felt strange, as though he'd been walking around without his skin. But the lightness in his chest was stranger still. "Certain?" He shook his head, stepping into the cool dimness of the hermitage. A spider scuttled across the rough-hewn table. Outside, the wind whistled through cracks in the stone. "No, but I am done with armor, done with titles, done with—" His voice trailed off as he looked around at the simple space, a hearth, a pallet, a single wooden stool. It was more than enough. Hubert opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Something in his master's face, the set of his jaw, the calm in his eyes, silenced the protest before it could form. Instead, the squire set about unpacking their meager supplies with quiet efficiency. The days that followed held a rhythm unlike any in Reginald's previous life. He rose with the sun, drew water from the well, and broke his fast with simple fare that stayed reliably where it belonged. The villagers from the valley below, once they overcame their awe at hosting a real live night, began leaving offerings at the foot of the hill, baskets of apples, wheels of cheese, and once memorably, a pair of exceptionally sturdy breeches with reinforced stitching. News still trickled up the winding path from the world below. The Duke, it was said, had retreated to his country estate and refused all visitors. Lord Percival now held court in the castle, his rule marked by an unusual lack of festive poisons. And in taverns across the land, the songs still played, though now there was a new verse about the Duke's downfall, often accompanied by raucous laughter and the clinking of tankards. Reginald neither sought out these tales nor avoided them. When traveling merchants paused to share gossip at his humble table, he listened with quiet amusement, then sent them on their way with a blessing and a handful of wild herbs. The anger that had carried him from the banquet hall had burned down to embers, leaving behind something softer, something like peace. One evening, as the first snow dusted the hilltop, Hubert announced his intention to leave. "Not forever," he hastened to add, stirring the stew bubbling over their fire. "But Lord Percival has offered me a position. Says a man of my talents shouldn't waste away up here with—" He trailed off, suddenly fascinated by the contents of the pot. "With a disgraced old knight?" Reginald finished, smiling when Hubert flushed. He reached across to clap the boy on the shoulder. Go. Serve well. And if you ever find yourself facing a suspiciously generous goblet of wine, I'll check for bubbles, Hubert promised solemnly. Then, because some things needed saying aloud, you could come back, you know. Now that the Duke's... Reginald shook his head, looking around at the hermitage, at the herbs drying by the hearth, the well-worn stool, the sturdy new breeches folded neatly in the corner. Outside, the snow fell silently, blanketing the world in quiet. I have everything I need, he said. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, it was true. Hubert departed at dawn, his horse's hooves leaving dark prints in the fresh snow. Reginald watched from the doorway until the last echo of hoofbeats faded, then turned back to his simple hearth. The fire crackled companionably. The wind sighed through the stones. Somewhere down in the valley, a minstrel might have been singing. But up here on the hill, there was only silence. And it was enough. Chapter 19. The Ballad's Legacy. Decades after the last snow had fallen on the old hermit's grave, the song still lived. In a bustling tavern near what had once been Duke Florian's castle, a minstrel plucked the familiar chords on a lute considerably newer than the tune. The crowd roared along to the chorus, tankards sloshing as they bellowed the well-worn lyrics about buckles and dignity. None of them knew Sir Reginald's face, nor could they say what had become of the Duke who'd orchestrated his humiliation. The specifics had faded like ink in the rain, leaving only the bones of the story behind, and the laughter, always the laughter. At a corner table, a young knight in gleaming armor shifted uncomfortably through each verse. His companions elbowed him good-naturedly, chanting along with the crowd. "Don't look so grim, Edwin," one laughed. "It's just a song." The knight forced a smile, his hand drifting unconsciously to check the fastenings of his own armor. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that wasn't quite his own whispered a warning about banquet invitations and suspiciously generous hosts. Outside, the wind whistled through the streets, carrying the melody over rooftops and down alleyways. Children skipped to its rhythm, their version of the lyrics growing increasingly ridiculous with each repetition. An old woman selling herbs in the market square hummed along absently as she bundled thyme and rosemary. The song had long since ceased to be about any particular knight or duke. It had become something bigger, a shared joke that transcended its origins. Far from the noise and merriment, on a quiet hilltop where the hermitage had long since crumbled back into the earth, the wind stirred the branches of an ancient oak. If anyone had been there to listen, they might have heard something like laughter in its rustling leaves. Not the cruel laughter of the banquet hall, but something gentler, wiser. The kind of laughter that comes when one finally sees the joke, even if it happens to be at one's own expense. Back in the tavern, the minstrel launched into the final verse, a newer edition that told of the Duke's downfall. The crowd cheered, their voices rising to the smoke-blackened rafters. The young knight in the corner finally relaxed, joining in the applause. Somewhere beyond time and memory, perhaps Sir Reginald did too. Chapter 20. The Moral, or Lack Thereof. If this were a proper tale, the kind sung by self-righteous bards, or written in heavy tomes by monks with too much time and ink, it would end with a lesson. A neat little proverb about pride, perhaps, or the fickle nature of honor. But life is rarely proper. Sir Reginald's story did not conclude with some grand redemption, nor did the Duke suffer divine retribution beyond what he brought upon himself. The Jester's ballad outlived them both, as ballads do, mutating with every retelling until the original knight in question was barely recognizable. The stable boy who had offered a cloak grew into a man who told the story to his children, though he could no longer recall the knight's name. Hubert served Lord Percival faithfully, though he never again polished a suit of armor without checking the buckles twice. As for Reginald, he lived out his days in quiet obscurity, though the villagers below the hill sometimes swore they heard laughter drifting down on the wind, dry, unbothered, the kind that comes from knowing no song, No banquet, no duke's petty machinations could ever truly break a man who refused to be broken. And if there is a moral to be found in all this, it is perhaps this: life is absurd, dignity is fragile, and sometimes the only thing to do when your codpiece fails in front of an entire court is to walk away, find a quiet hill, and let time turn humiliation into legend. Or perhaps there is no moral at all. Perhaps it is simply a tale, one of many in a world where history remembers not the brave, nor the wise, nor the just, but those who stumbled into stories worth telling. And in the end, isn't that its own kind of victory?